Today, we are joined yet again from someone outside Detroit to get an outside Detroit perspective on the Detroit Pistons season, their young core. We'll talk about all of that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button. We are just 100 subscribers away from, I believe, 9 or 8.9 thousand subscribers. We're trying to get to 10K by the end of the year. So please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, or you can leave us a 5-star review. Whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And as you guys have been seeing over the last few episodes, I'd say, and we have more episodes coming out in the future, I want to get some outside of Detroit perspectives on the Pistons' young core and on their season thus far, how they get out of where they're at right now. We were joined by Jackson Frank last week. He was a great guest. And today we are joined by my friend Esfandiar Baraheni. You can find him over on Raptors Republic. He does recaps over there. You can also find him doing Raptors coverage over at Forbes. And also you can find him on Twitter, obviously, as you can see on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube, at just Esfandiar Baraheni. Es, how you doing, man?
I'm good, man. I'm good. The Pistons are a guilty pleasure for me in a lot of ways. I've been a fan from afar for a little bit now. Cool, as you know, like we've talked about this team for a while, and so I'm kind of excited to get into it with you, man. Talk to you about the Pistons group.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if everyone shares that same excitement, but
you know, it's crazy. Every year for the last 2 years, I've been like playing Pistons, and they just keep going worse and worse and worse. And it's just, yeah, man. I would love to be right on that.
They share the same thought process with you every year, playing, and then it just goes down and down and down. So let's get into it. Let's go ahead and get into it. So
yeah,
today we'll talk about the Pistons young core is what we'll start off with. Then I want to get his thoughts on just the overall Pistons season in the second segment. Then to cap it all off, what do the Pistons need to do from his perspective to get out of where they're at, to really take the next step and just reach the play-in finally, get to the round there. But like I said, let's start with the Pistons young core. So the Pistons have what a lot of people in Detroit, at least, I think a lot of people consider it the same thing, a core 4 guys. They got Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Ausar Thompson, and Jalen Duren. Where are you at with the Pistons core 4? Are you high on them individually? Do you think they fit together? Do you think they may have to move off of one? Just what's your overall thoughts on the Pistons core 4 guys?
So let me just preface this by saying going into the season, I was extremely high on all 4 of them. And even more with the idea at the beginning of the year to start Ausar Thompson. I was really excited with what he could bring in terms of his defensive tools at the wing, at the point of attack. He showed that for the most part, but then, you know, the losing streak happened. The minutes kind of got lost. He got lost in the wind of things, and then we didn't really necessarily see that again, like that level of, I guess, usage, you would put it. But I think for the most part with everybody else, I'm still extremely high on what they can be. I'm still extremely high on Cade. I have not sold my Cade stock, as some people online on Twitter have. I still believe in Jaden Ivey. I still believe in Jalen Duren. I think individually, I believe in all of their talents. Collectively is where I become a little bit more skeptical as to how this might look long term. And the reason I say that is because, you know, some of those issues in terms of like rebuilding, right? We talk about rebuilding as this kind of, it's an ambiguous word, right? Nobody really knows. Like, yes, rebuilds are supposed to look a certain way. You look at like OKC, you look at Orlando that's done a good job. Some other teams, you know, Houston has gone a different route with their rebuild, but, you know, they're trying to figure things out as well. It's not a one size fit all type of thing, but the one thing you have to have in a rebuild is an environment that promotes growth for your players. And when it comes to the collective, when you look at that 4 group, I'm not necessarily sure that all 4 of those guys heighten each other in the way that can promote their development. That being said, I'm not fully out on that. I think it requires a little bit better coaching, to be honest with you. I think that requires, a little bit more creativity from the coaching staff in terms of how they're using the players. We can get into that a little bit if you want to, but I'm not out on the players. I'm more so out on the way the players are being used or being collectively put together. Now, to be fair, man, I think some of the trades that happen and some of the moves that you guys have made sort of help to address those. I like Simone Fontecchio in terms of a fit. I think that makes sense long term in terms of a guy who's like a 3-and-D, can space the floor for you guys type of player. But you need more of those guys, and you need some of the players that you already have to pan out into those complementary players. So, yeah, long-winded way of saying I trust in the individual. I'm not necessarily sure about the collective.
Yeah, and to kind of back up your point here, this has been something that's talked about, I think, all season with Pistons fans and the Pistons community, is whether those core four guys can fit. And one of the things you see in the Pistons community is there is a small section that believe, well, you can just bring one of them off the bench and, stagger them throughout and, get away with it. But I do agree with you. We talked about this with Jackson Frank last week. What you said is exactly what I believe. If you're going to have a core four guys, a core set of guys, your core guys should be elevating each other. You should be at your best when those four guys are on the floor. They should be at their best because they're surrounded by those guys and they all make each other better. I think one of the biggest reasons or biggest things they need to be finding out through this season, do these four guys fit together? Do they make each other better? And I think one of the biggest crimes this year has been that they just haven't seen them much. The coaching staff just hadn't played them. At the All-Star break, they'd only played around like 90 or to 100 minutes at the All-Star break. Now, since then, they're now at 201 minutes played together, which, okay, that's good. They've started them the last, I believe, 6 or 7 games, which is good to see. Right. In those 201 minutes, they have a net rating of minus 0.2. So they have a defensive rating of 109.18, which is really good. But then an offensive rating of 108.96. So they're basically just about even. Their offense is not, they're still figuring it out, especially in the half court because of the spacing, like you said, and the creativity. Yeah. But defensively, I think, like you mentioned with Asar Thompson, I think he just brings a different level. He makes things easy for other players, especially Jalen Duren. But even still, like you mentioned, I don't think anyone can say yes or no yet. Do these guys fit together? Can they play together? Because let's just say it, the spacing is not great.
Absolutely, man. Yeah.
And to add on to it, you just haven't got to see them that much. Like, you think that it would have been like the number one thing this year is to play those guys together and see what happens, and you just haven't seen a lot of it. Now, it looks like you're going to get a lot of it to end the year, but just so far, you haven't gotten a lot of it.
For what it's worth, I know Duren has been out with injuries a bit too, so that's part of the reason. Like, you haven't seen all four of them together. But I thought, like, Asar Thompson being thrown out of the rotation early in the season, especially during the losing streak, it was just inexcusable. Like, that to me was just such a jarring thing. And it just felt like the coaching staff and what the expectations for the players was not on the same page. And even the Jaden Ivey situation to start the year just felt like one side not being on the right page of the other. Now, we're obviously seeing him be more involved. He's now a permanent starter for this team, if I'm not mistaken. And it's been better. Like, they've played better. They've won 5 games in 2024, which is more than they won in 2020. You know what I mean? And, like, some of these solutions are just like not getting in front of yourself, like not getting in your own way. And I really do think some of the problems from Detroit has been just getting in the own way of the players' developments, whether it's Ivy and just kind of like letting him let loose, right? Using that athleticism, using that burst to be a transition threat. I think this Pistons team could be so much better in transition if it was just like, hey, we're grabbing off of rebounds, we're pushing, and that way we don't have to deal with a set half-court defense. And that's something that I've watched. Even now, when you look at their core, it's just they don't push as much as they should for a young team. And I feel like that's so much more that you can tap into by being a transition-oriented team. Now, I don't know. I think that's one of the areas where, like, you're leaving a little bit on the bone. But to be fair, it's the spacing is part of it, but you can manufacture spacing in different creative ways. And I don't think that's necessarily happened. Now, for what it's worth, you bring in a guy like Fontecchio. sure, you give Danilo Gallinari some minutes here and there, and like you work around that spacing to be able to do that, and maybe that facilitates some growth. But I'm not necessarily sure you can do that without addressing in the offseason by actually getting some real depth to this team.
Yeah, I'm happy that you brought that up. I spent last week's episode. It was one of the episodes last week. I spent like 13 minutes. JJ Redick on his podcast with Steve Jones and Nekias Duncan. They spoke about creating space with non-shooters, teams that do that. He mentioned Will Hardy. He mentioned Quinn Snyder. He mentioned Willie Green with the Pelicans. Those guys knowing how to create space and sets and creating actions offensively that create spacing with non-shooters. And I brought it up that's just something the Pistons have not done, that you've seen a lot of Asar in the corner. For what it's worth, they have started to run horns a little bit and to get like Asar into the action where you have Duren kind of on the block. He screens across to the opposite high post, kind of Duren clears out now to the low block, and then Asar runs the pick and roll. And that kind of helps a little bit. You can have some high man, low action. It creates a little bit of space for guys like Cade in the mid range. That's probably their most creative way there. They've run the hell out of that set. Like they just spam it. But there's a lot more other things you can do. But even with that, the players need to be better too. Coaching staff can be better. We'll find out whether these core guys can fit for the rest of the year. I feel pretty safe saying they're probably going to find out next year too. I don't think they're going to move off any of them this offseason. So I think you're going to get to even see some of it next year as well, at least for the first half of the year. But coming up, I want to talk to S about just the Pistons' overall season. Just how did it get so bad? Where did it go wrong? What was his thoughts before the year on the team? Did it match at all with what ended up happening? Just everything that happened with the Pistons season. We'll talk about that when we come back. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. A class-exclusive Google built-in is always your updating assistant to call on for almost everything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen information system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. The 2024 Nissan Pathfinder has room up to 8, an expansive cargo capacity, and advanced available 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, the Nissan Pathfinder, and the Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop at nissanusa.com. So
I might have to get me a Nissan. Damn,
Nissan's pretty dope, man. I might have to get myself one as well. It convinces me pretty well there too. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button at the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. All right, so obviously this season has went terribly for the Pistons. Absolutely terrible. I know some people seem to believe that they're tied with the Wizards for the worst record in the NBA. They're actually not. The Pistons still have the worst record. They have 8 wins, not 9. I don't know. I saw a Twitter account tweet that out, but I don't know where exactly
I saw that too. Yeah.
Who said it, but they have the worst record in the NBA. Like you said, they have won more this year than they won in the entire year of 2023. So I guess that's a level up a little bit. But this season obviously has went completely south. They almost broke the record all-time longest losing streak. They actually beat your Raptors, but for what it's worth, almost every single one of the Pistons wins have come a day after the team makes a trade and loses half their rotation. So
nice.
You guys get a little bit of a pass. But just what's your thoughts on the Pistons season so far? Like what went wrong in your opinion? Did they match? Like, is this what you thought was going to happen? Like what happened?
First of all, from the Raptors perspective, that loss, it's like, it's funny it's kind of been swept under the rug because it was the same day they traded OG, Precious, and Malachi. And so everybody kind of just chalked it up to, oh, well, they didn't have those players. They would have lost that game if they had those players. I guarantee you the Raptors would have lost that game if they had those players. So be secure in the thought that you guys broke that streak rightfully that night. Okay. Don't worry about it. The Raptors were just bad. And I still can't believe that's been swept under the rug. It's just because there's been a lot of bad Raptors losses this season. They're going through their own rebuild, different story for a different day. My expectations for the Pistons going into this year, honestly, was to make like a valiant effort at a play-in spot. I didn't think they would make the play-in. I thought the East was going to be fairly competitive, or at the very least, like competent at the bottom of the Eastern Conference. Now, to be fair, that hasn't happened. Brooklyn has been worse than I expected. Atlanta has been worse than I expected. Toronto is fighting, but for what reason type of thing right now. So it's been a bad Eastern Conference, but the Pistons have been even worse than that. And to me, that's really surprising. I thought this was going to be, especially after what you heard in the summer with the Team USA camp. You're like, Cade and Duran are dominating. These dudes are sweeping all-stars. And it's like, what's going on? I really bought into that. I don't know why I bought into that, because summer talk is always funny and it's always hilarious to like just, believe in that type of thing. But for some reason, I still believe in it. And it's weird because they have 8 wins or 9 wins, depending on who you ask. And I still somehow believe in this group figuring it out. I think there's just far too much talent. And I know it's crazy to say about an 8-win team because they haven't necessarily showed it. But like I said earlier, I really do think that a lot of their issues have been self-made. They've kind of gotten in their own way for certain things. And ultimately, I believe in Cade Cunningham. You listen to the quotes that he has post-game. I think the improvements that he's made to his game, despite the terrible context that he's working with, I think bodes well for the future of him as a player. Same thing with Jaden Ivey, answering back despite the whole minutes thing to start the year, becoming a really, really consistent player, improving as a three-point shooter. I think all of that is important to me. Duran is kind of young. He's figuring out what he can be in this league, but I like the fact that they've been giving him the ball more to operate and play make a little bit more. Asar is like this raw prospect, and for what it's worth, I think those type of prospects are trickier to work with because you're like they're like clay, right? And you got to mold them the way that you want to. Is this the right environment to necessarily mold a guy like that? I'm not necessarily sure, but I believe in these guys, truthfully, and I still had that belief going into the season. Ultimately, it's been a massive disappointment for me as an outsider, hoping that this Pistons team could get back to that, right? I came to Detroit last year talking about how like this is the, hopefully this is the start of a really, really important, I guess, moment for Pistons franchise history. And it just wasn't. It was actually, they had to take a massive step back. I look at this season as a weird like inflection point where maybe there's a level of like realization amongst the players, amongst the coaching staff, maybe ownership, maybe management, that just kind of like stockpiling these young, like, let's figure out a way to develop these guys type of thing isn't the necessary way to get them to that level. All of these rebuilds that have worked successfully, Orlando, Houston, OKC, whatever, they've done so by like leveraging their picks into something or getting young guys that fit the mold of their other young players, or getting veterans that can help mold the other guys. And I just don't know if the Pistons necessarily did that in any type of successful way over the last year or two. Hopefully they can this summer. So I don't know, in a long way, I was disappointed with this Pistons year, but it hasn't really removed my faith in what these players can be, oddly enough. Now, to be fair, it's from an outside perspective. I'm not watching every Pistons game. Sorry, I apologize. You guys are. And like I imagine it's tough from your perspective to have this much faith and optimism in a team that's only won 8 games this year, but I don't know.
So I think the reason why someone like yourself, I think most, maybe not most, but I think a lot of Pistons fans still have that faith. And it's because of some of the things you said. Like, a lot of the Pistons' failure this year was from themselves shooting themselves in the foot. Like, Troy Weaver in the front office did basically nothing last offseason. They didn't upgrade anybody. Their 2 big acquisitions are not on the roster. It was Joe Harris taking his contract on for a second-round pick. He wasn't even in the rotation. And
Yeah.
Monte Morris played like 4 or 5 games for them after missing the first 3 months of the year, and then they traded him.
Yeah.
So they really did nothing at all last offseason. They didn't add nobody. They didn't add vets. They didn't add 3-and-D players. Like, they didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And then, look, I'm not going to continue to beat the dead horse of Monty Williams right now because I've been pretty critical. I'm not trying to get in trouble anymore. All I'm going to say is, it's pretty bad when the beat writers are making full-on articles. Basically, I've never seen the beat writers in my 4 years of doing this be so critical of the Pistons organization. Usually the beat writers are usually getting destroyed by fans for being too optimistic and always defending the organization and all that. In the last week, last 2 weeks, you've seen them come out and just basically grill Monty Williams. So I think that's all you need to hear from that to know how bad that's going. So front office, I think, really failed them. The coaching staff has really failed them. Despite that, though, individually, the core 4 main guys, I think, is what brings that optimism. To know that it's I don't think anyone really looks at this season and looks at what's happened and says, oh, it's because Cade isn't good enough, or Ivy didn't take the step we thought, or he's not a good player anymore. That's why. Yeah. Or Duran didn't get better, or Duran's not good. That's why they've been so bad, or anything with the I don't think most people do that. I think most people look at him the surrounding pieces have been awful. The surrounding pieces were Cade was starting with Killian Hayes, who's not an NBA team right now. Isaiah Livers is gone, and he's not even playing the rest of the year for the Wizards. He's dealing with another. Those 2 guys were one of the worst players in the NBA this season. So I think the surrounding pieces just completely, Cade maybe could have been better. I mean, I think if you look at his,
let's talk about that because I see a lot of people online doing the whole Cade should be better than he is. And by the way, I tend to agree with people. It's he could be better than what he is right now in his 3rd season. But at the same time, he's probably dealing with the worst context of any lead ball handler in the league. The worst. It's not even close. There's not one player in the league. You could have maybe argued there were a couple guys to start the year, but now it's not. This is the worst context for any player, any lead ball handler. And you saw that. And just as soon as you inject a little bit of spacing, you bring Bojan back in, you add Fontecchio, now Bojan leaves, and now it's Fontecchio and some of these other guys. A little bit of spacing to make it just a little bit easier on him as a ball handler. He's played better. He's been more efficient. He's turning the ball over less. It's not hard to look at that and say that this is some of the worst context that a player has had to deal with. Now, to be fair, he could be better. Maybe he's not the generational, this is the next guy, this is the next LeBron James, like he was touted to be in the NBA draft. But that doesn't necessarily matter. This Pistons team isn't you're not riding on the fact, maybe some people are still, you're not riding on the fact that Cade Cunningham is going to turn into the next Kevin Durant or Luka Doncic or LeBron James or whatever. You just want him to turn into a really, really good player. And you want him to turn into a really good player next to Ivy, next to Duran, next to Asar. How are you going to do that? How are you going to facilitate that growth? Coaching staff, front office, finding guys who fit, finding guys who make sense around this team, make sense around Cade. That's the only way you're going to do it. You look at Houston. How did Houston bring out the best in Alperen Şengün? They went out and got 2 point-of-attack defenders in Dylan Brooks and Fred VanVleet who could insulate some of the defensive issues that Şengün had, and also a facilitator in VanVleet who could set up Şengün all the time. And that's one of the most efficient actions in all of basketball this season. Şengün looks like basically like an all-star this year because of that. Why? They got the pieces to facilitate the growth of their star. You got to do the same thing with Cade Cunningham. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's my spiel on believing in Cade still.
No, yeah, I mean, I've talked about that all year. I talked about it with Jackson, Frank last week. We went through the last 10 first overall picks, and outside of I don't know if Anthony Bennett's in the last 10, but we didn't include him. But all the other first round picks, you go through them, look at the situations they had around them and built around them, then compared to Cade. He's had by far the worst context, the worst team building around him of any top pick over the last 10 years. And even despite that, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, and then we'll move on. I don't want to turn into a full Cade on subject.
Sure, yeah.
Make it seem like that. People get mad at me when it sounds like I'm just riding so hard for Cade. But even the whole narrative around Cade is just, I don't feel like it's true at all. the idea that he hasn't been good this year or that he needs to be better. Like, I think a lot of that is based off the first 10 games of the year, like the last 34 games since then. And by the way, in between this, he had a knee sprain and didn't play well the first 5 games back from the knee sprain. Despite that, last 34 games, 22.5 points, 7.5 assists, 4.5 rebounds, shooting 48% from the field, 37% from deep, 85% from the free throw line. If you told me those were Cade's numbers his second year in the NBA, this is basically what it is. He only played 10 games last year or so because of his shin injury. Yep. This was basically what you said his second year was going to be. I don't think anyone would have been like, oh, bro, disappointment, failure.
Even better than that, if you were to not even mention Cade Cunningham's name and just give those statistics out, most people would be like, why is that guy not an all-star? So I think some of the conversation around Cade is ridiculous, but there is sure, there are valid things that he needs to work and improve on. There are valid limitations to his game, like every young player, like Scotty Barnes on the Toronto Raptors that I cover, like Şengün that I just mentioned. Paolo is another guy, has legit limitations to his game, but turned into an all-star this year because the Magic are better. They have a good roster around Paolo that accentuates some of his strengths, doesn't really accentuate a lot of them, but that's a different story for another day. You got to build around Cade to make him look better at the end of the day. And yeah, I know you don't want to make this a whole Cade podcast, but I guess that's just my outside opinion. Looking at this team, you don't need, I know a lot of Pistons fans are like, yo, he needs to turn into the guy, right? And rebuilds don't necessarily work that way, yo. They really don't. Sometimes you look at New York, right? The Knicks, who somehow got into Jalen Brunson. They got Julius Randle. They signed both of those guys, right? Did they expect Julius Randle to be a 2-time All-NBA player when they signed him to that contract? Hell no. Did they expect Jalen Brunson to become an All-NBA guy who's, some people are talking about lead a championship? Did they expect him to be that when they signed him for 4 years, $100 million? No way. But they expected Frank Ntilikina, who they drafted 5th overall. You know what I mean? They expected Emmanuel Mudiay to be a guy for them. None of those guys panned out, but the guys that they went out and got ended up being the thing. Rebuild is not a straightforward process. You're just trying to get an environment that promotes winning, that promotes growth, and hopefully one of these guys pops. That's all you're trying to do. And that's something I've been trying to harp on for Raptors fans too. As we enter this rebuild, it's not going to go the way you guys expect it to. It rarely does, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fair point. Some Pistons fans should keep in their minds as they watch this, I guess, restoration that Troy Weaver likes to call it happen over the next however long he's in the front office, which that's a topic for another day. When we come back, though, what's the next steps Detroit has to make to get out of where they're at? What do they have to do to get out of being the worst team in the NBA for back-to-back seasons? Let's not make it 3 straight years. What do they got to do to not be the worst team in the NBA anymore and actually have some hope? We'll talk about that when we come back. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Give online therapy a try at BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA and get on your way to being your best self. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off of our chest, whether it be big, small. Maybe you think it's not a big deal at all. Maybe you think it's something to completely, why do I even need to talk about it? I'm stupid for thinking that. No, not at all. It's big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased in your life. Instead of having it just built up inside, it's really important to let anything out that could possibly be bothering you. So today I want to tell you guys how I really feel about something. You might not even be thinking about the same thing this week. Something I've been thinking about that's really been getting on my nerves and, really affecting me. My coverage of the Pistons, man. It's been so tough. It's been really, really tough this year. With the coaching rotations, with the front office decisions, clicking that record button every day, man, it hasn't been easy. I've used this podcast, to be honest, as a way to let out my frustrations. But another great way to do it would be with BetterHelp. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, exactly like I just said. So maybe not the biggest issue there, but it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. All right, S, what do the Pistons need to do to get out of here, man? Not just like we're not even talking about to become like a championship level team. Just like let's not be the worst or the bottom 3 team in the entire NBA. Like
just be what I wanted y'all to be this season, which is like, hey, we'll make a valiant effort late. I remember I did my like preseason preview and it was like the over under for the Pistons was I think 27.5 or something. And I hit the over. I was like, they're winning 30 games this year. They haven't won 30 games in 5 seasons. This is the year they win 30 games. I was clearly wrong, but I hope that like next year, that is the goal, is to hit 30 plus games and, you know, kind of get to that point where you can be at least an interesting young team to watch every now and then. What they got to do, they have a lot of cap space this summer. I don't think they should go out and get Tobias Harris, as some people imagine, but I do think that they should use that cap space to go out and just add guys to their rotation, legitimate NBA players to their rotation that can help them. They're going to re-sign Fontecchio this year. I'm assuming that's going to be a pretty decent deal. It's not going to be a massive deal that will impact their cap space that much, but use that massive amount of cap space to go out and get rotation players for you. This free agency class is not one that has the star players, right? Like, yeah, sure, there's the Pascals and OGs, but they're going to be re-signed by the teams that they got traded for. James Harden's going to re-sign. Like, the top dogs are not going to be there, right? What you got to aim for is 2 or 3 guys. Honestly, I would take the same approach the Rockets did last season. And like, hey, let's get guys that can help facilitate the growth for this team. I think you have 4 or I'd say like 3 or 4 starting spots, you know, kind of assumed here in Cade, Ivy, and Duren. You can maybe talk me in and out of Asar depending on who you add as that 5th guy. Fontecchio has been interesting as a starting spot guy too, but you would ideally want to fill out your 3 and your 4 in terms of your starting rotation. You have Isaiah Stewart, you have Asar, you have Fontecchio. Those are guys that you have at least long-term. Marcus Sasser, also another guy that you have. I know you guys are going to be missing him for the next couple of weeks, but still, I think that cap space should be used to filling out your rotation with legitimate NBA players. Who that is, like, you know better than me. I'm sure you guys have been already talking about it so far. I haven't looked into the free agency class as much yet, but I would say just go out and get rotation players that can really help this team.
Yeah, for what's worth, I don't think they're going to be using their cap space in free agency. I think they're going to be using it to facilitate trade somehow and take on a big contract. At least that's what it seems like they're trying to do, in my opinion. They're trying to, in order to do that, you need to take on some kind of contracts to be able to flip. Right now, they don't have, unless they just, they could just take on a contract for picks, but I don't know if there's a player that's going to become available in the offseason if they want to do something like that for. Sure. But we see those kind of guys happen every offseason, just out of nowhere, like 2 or 3 guys that end up wanting out or whatever. So I think that's what they're trying to position themselves for. I like how you brought up filling out guys that, you know, make the young guys better. Brought up Fontecchio. For what it's worth, this is a small sample size since the trade happened. But they've been starting those 5 together the last 7 games. In those 7 games, in the minutes they've played together, they are a plus 2.92 net rating. They have a 111.7 offensive rating, so not a great offense, but their defense remains really spectacular with those 5 guys. Is 108.7. So I think there's something to see there. Overall, the idea is to get a 5th guy in there that, like you mentioned, can shoot, can space the floor, and also defend. If it's Fontecchio next year, whether it's someone better than Fontecchio, we'll see what happens. I think this is a question I want to ask you because we haven't talked about this a lot in the podcast yet. I've been saving it for towards the end of the year. So we'll hint at it a little bit. This is for you guys to really know that coming up, like over the next few weeks, this is something we're really going to start talking about. I think it's it's crazy. I haven't heard many Pistons fans talk about it. You'd think that it's something that like is pretty damn important. The Pistons are projected right now, obviously, have the top odds in the draft. If it like with the draft was today and no lottery, like obviously they'd have the first pick. Now the lottery has screwed them like back-to-back years. Falling to 5. But just take the lottery out of it. If the Pistons get the first overall pick, do you think they should use it or do you think they should trade it?
That's a good question. I think it depends on what's out there for the first overall pick because we know that this is a weaker draft, but at the same time, like maybe there's a team that's like at 8 or 9 that just falls in love with the dude, right? Like is like, we need Alex Sarr on our team, or we need whoever, Ron Holland. I don't know. I'm not really tapped into the 2024 draft like that, but like those are the guys that I keep hearing about. What if though, a team falls in love with one of those guys? It's like, that's the missing piece for us. We need that guy. The Raptors might end up with their pick, top 6 protected, whatever. If they end up with like the 7th pick, would they be willing to move? I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what it would look like, but there is an opportunity there for that to happen. I could see it being something that could work. I don't know though. I'm not sure. I think depending on what you need, maybe there's something there that can fill that need, right? Ron Holland is a guy who like matches as that like defensive minded wing. I think that could work well with what the team needs too. So maybe that's a guy you look for. Him and Asar could be really interesting defensive minded wise. But at the same time, it's an interesting thought. At the very least, it's an interesting thought exercise to be like, hey, should they potentially move off of this pick to go out and get some other players, because they have their guys locked in so far with Cade, Ivy, and Duren. And the other thing is Cade is extension eligible, right? So like that's going to dig into the cap space as well, because I'm assuming he's going to get an extension this summer, whatever that extension might be. So, yeah, that's probably part of it at least. But yeah,
I think we'll wrap up the podcast here, but I think they should. I'm leading almost like 90%. They need to trade it. I just don't think. I think going into year 5 of a rebuild with those, earlier in the podcast we talked about, is this the right environment to develop all 4 of those guys? Is it the right development to develop the SAR with all these other guys? You add yet another top pick. Now you got 5 guys you're trying to develop.
True.
Cade's going to be entering his extension. Now you got I feel like you're just at that point 5
and
guys.
They thought about trading the Asar pick too, right? Like
it was something they kicked around. Yeah,
that was on the table. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it's impossible. I would not say it's impossible.
But Alex Sarr, I think on this team, if they were to be able to get him, that would be interesting. It would be interesting. But overall, what the Pistons need to do to get out of this, just add NBA players. Don't walk into the season with the corpse of Joe Harris and Killian Hayes and Isaiah Livers taking up half your rotation minutes and then benching. It really is
that easy. It really is that easy. Like, just add guys that actually play in the NBA. Joe Harris was on the tail end of a contract. He was injured a bunch. Monte Morris, same thing. It's like, dude, just get guys who can help you right now. And look, man, another thing is like maybe those guys don't want to come. Maybe they don't. But like there are a lot of them here in this free agency class. And I think that would be something worth going for. If I were the Pistons, I wouldn't do the whole let's absorb a contract to get picks type of thing. I don't think that's where they're at. I think they need to go out and get guys who can help facilitate the growth of Cade and Ivy and Duren and Asar and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah, they missed their opportunity to do that. They should have done that their first year, but they decided not to do that. They decided to sign Jeremy Grant, Mason Plumlee, and now you got Oklahoma, you got San Antonio, you got Houston, you got all these other teams with about 6-7 picks, and the Pistons don't even have their own pick because they owe it to New York and the Isaiah Stewart trade. But that's another topic for another day. Great asset management, Troy Weaver. I appreciate you, S, for coming on the podcast, man. Like I said earlier, you guys can find him over on Twitter at JustSBaraheni. Again, you can find some of his work over on Raptors Republic. You can also find some of his Raptors coverage at Forbes. Thank you for coming on today again. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button at the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace out.